Totem and Taboo, Resemblances Between the Psychic Lives of Savages and Neurotics, by Professor Dr. Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Totem and Taboo, Chapter 2, Taboo and the Ambivalence of Emotion, Part 2. A. The Treatment of Enemies. Inclined as we may have been to ascribe to savage and semi-savage races uninhibited and remorseless cruelty towards their enemies, it is of great interest to us to learn that with them too the killing of a person compels the observation of a series of rules which are associated with taboo customs. These rules are easily brought under four groups. They demand 1. Reconciliation with the slain enemy, 2. Restrictions, 3. Acts of expiation and purifications of the manslayer, and 4. Certain ceremonial rites. The incomplete reports do not allow us to decide with certainty how general or how isolated such taboo customs may be among these races. But this is a matter of indifference as far as our interest in these occurrences is concerned. Still, it may be assumed that we are dealing with widespread customs and not with isolated peculiarities. The reconciliation customs practiced on the island of Timor after a victorious band of warriors has returned with the severed heads of the vanquished enemy are especially significant because the leader of the expedition is subject to heavy additional restrictions. Quote from Fraser. At the solemn entry of the victors, sacrifices are made to conciliate the souls of the enemy, otherwise one would have to expect harm to come to the victors. A dance is given and a song is sung in which the slain enemy is mourned and his forgiveness is implored. Be not angry, they say, because your head is here with us. Had we been less lucky, our heads might have been exposed in your village. We have offered the sacrifice to appease you. Your spirit may now rest and leave us at peace. Why were you our enemy? Would it not have been better that we should remain friends? Then your blood would not have been spilt, and your head would not have been cut off. End quote. Similar customs are found among the Palu in Celebes. The Gallas sacrifice to the spirits of their dead enemies before they return to their home villages. Other races have found methods of making friends, guardians, and protectors out of their former enemies after they are dead. This consists in the tender treatment of the severed heads, of which many wild tribes of Borneo boast. When the Sea Dayaks of Sarawak bring home a head from a war expedition, they treat it for months with the greatest kindness and courtesy, and address it with the most endearing names in their language. The best morsels from their meals are put into its mouth, together with tidbits and cigars. The dead enemy is repeatedly entreated to hate his former friends and to bestow his love upon his new hosts because he has now become one of them. It would be a great mistake to think that any derision is attached to this treatment, horrible though it may seem to us. Observers have been struck by the mourning for the enemy after he is slain and scalped among several of the wild tribes of North America. When a Choctaw had killed an enemy, he began a month's mourning during which he submitted himself to serious restrictions. The Dakota Indians mourned in the same way. One authority mentions that the Osage Indians, after mourning for their own dead, mourned for their foes as if they had been friends. Before proceeding to the other classes of taboo customs for the treatment of enemies, we must define our position in regard to a pertinent objection. Both Fraser as well as other authorities may well be quoted against us to show that the motive for these rules of reconciliation is quite simple and has nothing to do with ambivalence. These races are dominated by a superstitious fear of the spirits of the slain, a fear which was also familiar to classical antiquity, and which the great British dramatist brought upon the stage in the hallucinations of Macbeth and Richard III. From this superstition, all the reconciliation rules, as well as the restrictions and expiations which we shall discuss later, can be logically deduced. Moreover, the ceremonies included in the fourth group also argue for this interpretation, since the only explanation of which they admit is the effort to drive away the spirits of the slain which pursue the manslayers. Besides, the savages themselves directly admit their fear of the spirits of their slain foes and trace back the taboo customs under discussion to this fear. This objection is certainly pertinent, and if it were adequate as well, we would gladly spare ourselves the trouble of our attempt to find a further explanation. We postpone the consideration of this objection until later, and for the present merely contrast it to the interpretation derived from our previous discussion of taboo. All these rules of taboo lead us to conclude that other impulses besides those that are merely hostile find expression in the behavior towards enemies. We see in them manifestations of repentance, a regard for the enemy, and of a bad conscience for having slain him. It seems that the commandment, "Thou shalt not slay," which could not be violated without punishment, existed also among these savages, long before any legislation was received from the hands of a god. We now return to the remaining classes of taboo rules. The restrictions laid upon the victorious manslayer are unusually frequent and are mostly of a serious nature. In Timor, compare the reconciliation customs mentioned above, the leader of the expedition cannot return to his house under any circumstances. A special hut is erected for him in which he spends 2 months engaged in the observance of various rules of purification. During this period he may not see his wife or nourish himself. Another person must put his food into his mouth. Among some Dayak tribes, warriors returning from a successful expedition must remain sequestered for several days and abstain from certain foods. They may not touch iron and must remain away from their wives. In Logia, an island near New Guinea, men who have killed an enemy or have taken part in the killing lock themselves up in their houses for a week. They avoid every intercourse with their wives and friends. They do not touch their victuals with their hands and live on nothing but vegetable foods which are cooked for them in special dishes. As a reason for this last restriction, it is alleged that they must smell the blood of the slain. Otherwise they would sicken and die. Among the Toaripi or Motu Motu tribes of New Guinea, a manslayer must not approach his wife and must not touch his food with his fingers. A second person must feed him with special food. This continues until the next new moon. I avoid the complete enumeration of all the cases of restrictions of the victorious slayer mentioned by Frazer, and emphasize only such cases in which the character of taboo is especially noticeable, or where the restriction appears in connection with expiation, purification, and ceremonial. Among the Monumbos in German New Guinea, a man who has killed an enemy in combat becomes unclean, the same word being employed which is applied to women during menstruation or confinement. For a considerable period he is not allowed to leave the men's clubhouse, while the inhabitants of his village gather about him and celebrate his victory with songs and dances. He must not touch anyone, not even his wife and children. If he did so, they would be afflicted with boils. He finally becomes clean through washing and other ceremonies. Among the Natchez in North America, young warriors who had procured their first scalp were bound for 6 months to the observance of certain renunciations. They were not allowed to sleep with their wives or to eat meat, and received only fish and maize pudding as nourishment. When a Choctaw had killed and scalped an enemy, he began a period of mourning for 1 month, during which he was not allowed to comb his hair. When his head itched, he was not allowed to scratch it with his hand, but used a small stick for this purpose. After a Pima Indian had killed an Apache, he had to submit himself to severe ceremonies of purification and expiation. During a fasting period of 16 days, he was not allowed to touch meat or salt, to look at a fire, or to speak to anyone. He lived alone in the woods, where he was waited upon by an old woman who brought him a small allowance of food. He often bathed in the